Good evening, counselors and people of the public. My name is Dr. Jane Arlander, and as an introduction, I'll share with you a little information about my background. I've been in the medical field for 40 years. I'm currently a registered nurse and physician in Massachusetts. Most important of all, however, I was born in Salem, and I've been a longtime resident of 93 Federal Street, a home that is less than 300 feet from the Universal Steel property. As an abutter to an abutter, I have been an eyewitness to the activities at the 297-305 Bridge Street property for more than 50 years. I'm here tonight because I'm adamantly opposed to declaring the Universal Steel property as surplus land to be sold and redeveloped. As a medical professional, I believe that there will be negative public health consequences if the capped Universal Steel site is breached for the purpose of redevelopment. Given the history of the Federal Street neighborhood's chronic and acute exposures to harmful substances, I think that I will, be waiting to hear get more of the information that we are promised, and I shall consult with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health on this grave matter of public health and safety. Without exception, this city's #1 priority when making any decision is to protect the health and safety of its residents. That being said, it's my opinion that our city has an obligation to keep the Universal Steel parking lot and to maintain and oversee its current condition of no significant risk to human health. Let me emphasize that the bottom line for all of our discussions relating to the disposition of the Universal Steel property is that the EPA currently endorses the use of this land as a parking lot and believes that it poses no health risks to the public if maintained appropriately. Now, we have heard some public testimony supporting the position that the city should sell the Universal Steel parking lot to a business that would elevate the use of the property and clean up more of the contamination. The problem with this argument is, again, it fails to address the public health risks of a major construction project and the required, at this point, it's not remediation, but soil removal. In medicine, just because there's a bullet lodged near the spinal cord doesn't mean that you have to take it out. One must weigh the consequences. Yes, the Universal Steel property is still contaminated, but to open up this site again will only expose innocent people to dangerous toxins. And right now, the use of the Universal Steel parking lot poses no risk to human health. Now, I have been a resident on Federal Street, and I've gone through 3 prior cleanups. In 1994, or actually 1993, the Universal Steel site was undergoing being sold. And the president of Tewksbury Industry, whose name was Tom Bowley at the time, was interested in purchasing this business, which had been operating at the Universal Steel site since 1936. And as part of purchasing this property, they began doing some soil testing. So this was the initial soil testing that was done at 297-305 Bridge Street. There was some testing done at 90, 92, and 100 Federal Street. So what did they find? They found PCBs, they found cadmium, chromium, mercury, arsenic, asbestos. They found hazardous petroleum-based compounds. Some of them were volatile, the chlorobenzene. I mentioned some of the heavy metals like lead and mercury. What a misfortune for a community to be exposed to these harmful substances for so many years. I guess that's my 7-minute beeper, or 5-minute.
All right, but if you can wrap up.
Let me just wrap up a couple of things. During these environmental cleanups, there was so much dust. There were vibrations. There was noise. And not only that, but the cleanups were first in the Federal Street neighborhood properties. In fact, in 1994, when the first testing was done, what Weston and Sampson did, they came down, they put a fence, a perimeter fence around the Universal Steel site. They didn't do any cleanup, but they came up to Federal Street, and on 90, 92, and 100 Federal Street, they cleaned up, excavated some of the PCB soils. And then in 2006, Mass DEP requested more soil and groundwater tests up on some of the abutting properties, again, Federal Street and also Beckford Street at this time. And again, they found PCB-laden soils. And at that time, Haley and Aldrich, which was an environmental engineering firm out of Boston, they came up and excavated the soils. Now, the only people that knew that these excavations were going to occur were the owners of the homes up on Federal Street. The tenants were never told, and to have people in hazmat suits show up in the neighborhood with no indication that was going on was very frightening. The final cleanup in 2011. Remember, the first two cleanups only involved the Federal Street residences and Beckford Street residents. In 2011, when they did the comprehensive site assessment, they finally turned their attention to Universal Steel. And that was supposed to be a 2 to 4 month operation. It ended up being a 10-month nightmare for the neighborhood. Now, I will say that we were well informed that this was going to occur. So we knew approximately when it was going to occur, but none of us ever could imagine what we had to go through. The very first day, the vibrations were so bad in my house, I couldn't take it anymore. I went down to the site. I asked to see Tom Hazopoulos, who was the EPA project manager at the time, and he wasn't there. They continued doing the work and shaking my house. A little later on in the day, he came up to my house. I had to leave by then, and later the next day, he said to me, I came up to your house, and I said, oh, it's probably some old crank complaining. He said, but while I was at your door, I looked up, and I could see your window shaking. So I knew there was something wrong. For 10 months, we had vibrations like that. And vibrations are considered an environmental pollutant, as is noise. Now, one of the things that was just most egregious was the fact that they had to treat soil for lead. To take a ton of soil that hasn't been treated with a phosphate compound to stabilize the lead, it's $1,000 a ton. To treat it on site and then take it to a disposal site, it's $275 a ton. So the EPA, they were slow in their process, and we were wondering what was going on, and we said, well, we just found lead in the soil.
Ms. Arlander, can you please bring
Yes.
this? Thank you.
Well, anyways, it ended up being that they had to small batch mix it. They had to bring in tons of this phosphate. They laid out the PCB soils. They mixed them right on site. The dust in my screens, the dust all over the house. It was amazing. And I'm sure there are other people here that will discuss, other aspects of this. But I'd like to conclude with 2 comments. After more than 77 years and $4 million of public money, the EPA has finally created a reasonable permanent solution and a condition of no significant risk to human health at the former Universal Steel site. A brownfield site with dilapidated buildings has been cleaned up and capped, an economically viable parking lot with the potential to make parking easier for hundreds of employees that come from the courthouse and jurors has been created. To disturb this achievement and expose abutting neighborhoods, a riverside park, and a community at large to additional health risks that we've already had with the cleanups would be a public health travesty. Finally, from a public health perspective, there should be no change in ownership of this Universal Steel property until the current owner, the City of Salem, openly addresses the contamination of the abutting Federal Street and Beckford Street properties. Portions of these residential properties were cleaned up prior to the cleanup of the Universal Steel site, and most likely have been recontaminated by the exchange of contaminated groundwater during the years between their cleanup and the 2012 cleanup of the Universal Steel site. Remember, in 1994, when the first cleanup was done, Universal Steel was still in operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arlander. Else in the room?